Shalom, everyone, and welcome to our Global Partnership Village. My name is Eliad Eliyahu, and I'm the Partnership Director of Yokneam Megiddo Atlanta St. Louis. And we are very, very happy to have you here with us tonight, or this afternoon, if you're from Atlanta or St. Louis. And with us tonight, Professor Stein from Emory University. He will actually introduce himself and the amazing story that he can share with us. With no further ado, in order to give you the stage, Professor Stein, thank you so much for doing it and sharing your insights, experiences with all of us. The stage is yours.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank the partnership. Thanks to people of St. Louis and my fellow Atlantans, as well as the folks in Yokneam and everyone who's joining us from around the globe. A brief word about myself, a brief word about what I'm hope to do. We'll have time at the end for those listening to either ask questions or put them in the chat, however Eliad wishes to do, and Hilla wish to do it. First, a little bit about myself, then a little bit about what I won't be able to talk about because I'm not really an expert on. And then talk a little bit about a comparison of Israel education with education in Israel education in the United States or North America, and make some comments on where we could go, how did we get here, and what the future holds. To start with, I have just finished 43 years of teaching at Emory University in Atlanta. Mostly undergraduates, about 6,000 undergraduate students over a period of that time. Less number of graduate students. And most of the courses that I've taught have been dealing with the history of modern Israel, the Arab-Israeli conflict, the rise of Islam, the Ottoman Empire, the modern Arab world, and topics that deal generally with American foreign policy. Most of my time in the classroom has been with undergraduates in lectures and in seminars. The second part of the experience that is relevant is for the last 20 years, quite coincidentally, I stumbled upon the prospects of helping Jewish teachers who are teaching in Jewish schools, teaching in day schools and congregational schools and JCCs and Meltons, sometimes camp staffers, sometimes staffers of national Jewish organizations like AJC, ADL, JNF, to help them better comprehend Israel's story. What I mean by Israel's story is, how did Israel come into being? Wasn't so interested so much in helping individuals understand the theology or the ideology of Zionism, as much as telling the story of what happened between 1880 and the 1960s. How did you go from 22,000 or 24,000 Jews in the 1880s to 660,000 in 1947 or 48? And the reason I stumbled upon this is that actually I was asked by Jewish teachers here in Atlanta, in one of the day schools, to help them construct a curriculum. To help them provide them enduring understandings and how to ask the right questions that related to what is it we want our students to learn and understand or comprehend about Israel. And to my surprise, I realized what they didn't know. And it was surprising for me because I had sat on the personnel committee of this day school for well over 15 years. And I didn't know that the 7th and 8th graders were not even taking the course on modern Zionism or Israel. And from that evolved a series of seminars and workshops, and over a period of these 20 years, able with a great team of folks who work with me and what we now have, the Center for Israel Education. I'll talk a little bit about that at the end. To help teachers, both in terms of best practices as well as content, to understand Israel's story. Personally, I grew up on Long Island in the 40s and 50s. My parents were Jews who immigrated from Germany, rural Orthodox German Jews, actually. I know that sounds almost like an oxymoron, that they would be rural and Orthodox, but they were. And grew up in a Jewish home. Everything was kosher. I was one of maybe 8 or 10 students in a high school on Long Island that were Jewish. The rest was primarily Catholic, white Catholic and Black. I didn't grow up in the North Shore, I didn't grow up in the South Shore. I grew up in pretty much an environment where there weren't a lot of Jews in my high school. I went to the University of Michigan, a BA from Franklin Marshall College, master's and PhD from the University of Michigan. And I lived for 2 years in Beit HaKerem on Rehov Chalutz, and attended the Hebrew University as a graduate student, and did a lot of archival research at the Central Zionist Archives and the Elam Kriya at the Hebrew University, and used Israel as a laboratory for learning. And I wrote a dissertation, actually the land question in Palestine, how did they do it? And there I got exposed to the how of the state and how it was created. So I have a positive ideology, a commitment. Maybe I'm an addict to what you would call history and to my discipline. I believe in knowing the story makes you belong to the story, and if you belong to the story, you can own the story. And that's pretty much the philosophy I've tried to follow with those who tried to learn about modern Israel. So how is Israel learned in the United States or in North America, and in comparison to what is learned and how it's learned in Israel? The first caveat is I don't know very much about Canadian Israel education or educating about Israel in Canadian schools, either colleges or universities or in the Jewish community, because I haven't spent any time there. I do know a little bit about Mexico and Mexico City because I spent some time working with their teachers on curriculum. But pretty much what I have to say is relevant to my American experience. In Israel, as compared to the United States, Israeli students live Israeli history. They're aware of family members who immigrated, how many generations ago. They know who served in what wars. They know about business and industry and enterprise. Many of them have done compulsory service, whether it's government service or in the army. Many of them are fully aware of their experience maybe in pre-college and Ghana. In Israel, the teachers, by and large, in the secondary school or in colleges, do not teach a dislike of Israel. They may teach difficult issues, but not unlike in the United States, when you may find yourself at a college, you may find a professor at a university that's an adversary of Israel because he or she doesn't particularly like Israeli policy or Israeli politics or Israeli politicians. In the United States, we have a very different experience on campus, both before and after B'nai and Bat Mitzvot. And I think it's very important, critical, to understand that Israel learning or Israel education in the United States is not guided or studied because there's a curriculum. Now, in Israel, over the years, you have changed the curriculum for secondary schools, for post-secondary schools, well, or elementary schools when it comes to Ezrachut, or if it comes to Israel learning, you include this or that kind of concept or this or that kind of community building and learning. That doesn't exist in the United States. Here, Israel education is governed not by any state educational system with a set criteria of what should be learned or how it could be learned or options for learning. Here, it's pretty much whoever's teaching it makes the decision and makes the determination on what it is you're going to learn and how you're going to learn it. Now, unless you're a speaker of Hebrew, most of your learning about Israel is going to come from, if you're attending a Jewish school, which could be a day school or a congregational school. And I have to point out that less than half of American Jewish youth between the ages of 5 and 18 attend any Jewish school at all. In other words, there is no necessary reason for someone to come in contact with Israeli history or the Israeli Declaration of Independence or Ben Gurion or Herzl unless they are in some formal education, or they happen to have some informal experiential education where they happen to reach out and be contacted by individuals while they, let's say, were on a trip, birthright or a mission, or they had a camp experience. So everything that's learned about Israel in the United States is pretty helter-skelter in the sense there's not a middle, there's not a beginning, a middle, and an end. There's not a set curriculum, a set series of enduring understandings that you want people to come away with. There are the experiential undertakings, the missions, trips, the camps, etc. And then what you learn on college campuses, I did a study of this about 20 years ago, and I don't think it's changed very much, is that when people learn something about Israel and they take a course about something to do with Israel, something like 75% of what they're learning through the context of the Arab-Israeli conflict. They're not necessarily learning about Israeli society, Israeli identity, women in Israeli culture, Israeli literature, Hebrew language. What they're learning on the basis of the struggle, of the basis of the conflict, of the basis of Israel versus the Arabs. And that's a very skewed understanding of what Israel is. It doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. It just means it's not very complete. It means it's not extensive. It's not broad. And certainly what I've learned is when they learn about the conflict, people learn about the conflict usually from points of view. Rather than a history, they'll learn so-and-so's narrative or so-and-so's narrative, and they'll be learned in parallel, rather than learning why did Israel come into being? Why is Israel a necessary outgrowth, or one of the outgrowths of modern Jewish history? Little time is spent, for example, that Zionism was a choice that Jews made in the 18th century, like they made a choice to reform Judaism or conservative Judaism, or they chose Marxism, or they chose socialism, or they chose to leave Eastern and Western Europe and change their geography and go to Australia or South Africa or Charleston or Boston, Washington, New York, wherever they ended up. What is learned instead is, what was the last conflict or confrontation between Israel and a Palestinian? What was the last issue that Israel had vis-a-vis its relationship between a president and a prime minister? The context is absent. And because there is no context and there is no perspective, or very little context and very little perspective, what happens is people come away with a skewed understanding of what is Israel, a very skewed understanding. When studies were recently undertaken of what kids learn in day schools in the United States, Jewish day schools, schools that are devoted to Israel, to Jewish learning on a daily basis, where half the curriculum may be Jewish studies and the other half may be secular studies, if we can use that term. Most of the learning had to do with learning about leaders, had to do about Ursula Nordau and Weitzman and Golda and Moshe Dayan and Rabin, heroic stories. Or there were heroic stories about military exploits, Six-Day War, Israel survived in 1948, or wasn't that a great story to be told about Israel on July 4th, 1976, when they liberated Jews from Entebbe? But the story about the people, the story about day-to-day life, the story about Israeli literature, Just, how many people know that there's a guy by the name of Aleph Bet Yehoshua or Amos Oz or Appelfeld? I don't think most American Jews could name 5 or 6 Israeli authors. Well, that's why, because when they grew up in America, they learned American authors. They learned Hemingway. They learned Robert Frost. They learned the great writers of the 19th and 20th century. Why would American Jews even know very much about Israeli authors unless they may have had a parent or they may have had a teacher along the way who may have exposed them to some great novels and some great short stories? They wouldn't have it. When you learn Israel or learn about Israel in the United States, you may be exposed to what happens in the community. You may be exposed to a Jewish film festival, or you may be exposed to a Jewish music festival, or you may be exposed to events that may be celebrated community-wide, let's say like Israel's Independence Day, or Yom HaShoah, or Yom HaZikaron, what I call the Yoms. But Israel is more than the Yoms. Israel's about people and interactions and how they get along with one another or don't. And not all about controversy and not all about struggle. How many American Jewish youth can actually name 4 Jewish holidays? Just 4. I'm not talking about Hanukkah or Pesach. I'm talking about Yom HaShoah, Yom HaAtzmaut, Yom HaZikaron, Yom Yerushalayim. Maybe they know Lag BaOmer, I'm not so certain. So, unlike Israel, American Jews, and we are about the same number that there are in Israel. I'm roughly saying 6.5 million. Now, there are more probably in Israel than there are in the United States or North America today. But I would argue that unless you are a devotee of streaming Israeli television, you may know something about Sugrim or Stessel or Homeland or Beauty and the Baker or Fauda. But that's a slice. And I would argue that a slice is not enough. That taking one course does not make you a specialist about what is Israel. And it regrettably sometimes leaves an impression, which is not the impression that one would want to leave if one were an educator. My view is that we in America learn our history, Jewish or non-Jewish. We learn the American Revolution, we learn about America's presence abroad, we learn about slavery's impact on American society, World War I, World War II, Vietnam, Korea, the Gulf War, Afghanistan, Iraq. American Jewish kids who go off to college don't necessarily have Israel as a part of their DNA. They may be aware of it because they've had a great experience in going to a Jewish camp, a good experience in going on a family trip to Israel or participating in birthright. But there's nothing that's systematic. Take a look at yourselves, those of you who are living in Israel. Take a look at all of what you're exposed to growing up in Israel. How many different places have you been to and visited the archaeology? How many different places, how many different times how many different places can you name that are these amazing intersections both intellectually and physically in the country. I can ask someone, so where are you from? And they'll say, I'm from near Haifa. And I can say, is that near or far from the Druze village? Well, I think I know that because I've only been to the country 50 times with my own rental car driving around the country. But that's an exception to the rule. What we know is that American Jews don't know as much as they should about Israel. And I would argue that Israeli Jews don't know that much about the American Jewish community and how we operate. There's a big gap between us. I would even argue, if I could say it, we may be one tribe, but many minions. Or I know minions is not the Hebrew plural, but I'm using it here with a little bit of license, if you permit me. What is it that we might want to do in order to change the reality? We asked the question in the United States, and many authors have written about this in the last decade, the so-called distancing between American Jewish youth and Israel. What does that mean? Well, if you have distancing, it must mean you must have been close. You can't have distancing if you haven't been close to one another previously, but maybe you were never close. And maybe it's because our parents, and here I can't speak about my parents because they had Judaism and Israel in their bones, because they almost were immigrants to Israel in the 30s and they ran out of immigration certificates, so they ended up at Ellis Island, New York. So, otherwise I would have been, I would have been interviewing you instead of you interviewing me right now. We have come to a point where even a discussion of Israel can be toxic. I gave a talk in front of 55 or 60 rabbis in Washington, D.C. a couple of years ago. And I asked them how many sermons were they going to give on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and they said 4, Rosh Hashanah 2 days, Kol Nidre, and on Yom Kippur. I said, how many of those would you be talking about Israel? They said, oh no, can't talk about Israel from the Bima, because whatever I say, someone's going to take the wrong point of view. And I said to a couple of the rabbis who were more senior, notice I didn't use the word elderly, more senior. I asked them, I said, 25 years ago, how many of those sermons, those 4 major sermons, would you have used to address the topic of Israel? And they said, oh, probably 2 or 4. Well, 25 years ago was just before Rabin's assassination, perhaps, with so-called hope of maybe something was going to evolve in Arab-Israeli or Palestinian-Israeli negotiations. But that very answer told me that they were talking about peace and negotiations and a peace process, and not necessarily talking about some aspect of modern Israel. Until recently, I didn't realize that some American rabbis, when they study in Israel, don't do a lot of contemporary learning about Israel, but they do a lot of text study and they do a lot of work in learning about the country. And maybe sometimes when they come back to the United States, as younger rabbis, they don't want to touch on Israel. You interview a rabbi for a new position at a congregation, you dance around the topic of how you're going to teach Israel, how are you going to deal with Israel in your congregation. It's got to be the safest place in North America to be talking about issues that relate to Jewishness and Judaism and Jewish-related topics, but for many, it's a little bit unnerving. What I'd like to see, and what I've learned, is that teachers are not looking to identify necessarily with a leader or leaders who were great in Israeli history. And there were many good ones and great ones. And they're not happy at all that one of the major conduits for learning about Israel is the avenue from the Holocaust to redemption. Can you imagine if you're a Jewish kid and your only exposure to Israel is that this terrible thing happened to the Jewish people between 33 and 45, and then lo and behold, in 48, the Jewish state was created. I mean, the March of the Living is precisely that. Not that we should forget what happened between 33 and 45. But if all we do is tie the history and the politics of modern Israel to what other people did to us, rather than what we did for ourselves, then we have shortchanged the next generation. If we don't tell them that Zionism was not just a movement, but it was a move. Israel Kolot, the great Zionist historian who taught at the Hebrew University, makes the case that Zionism gave Jews the opportunity to engage with history, to be the subject in their sentences and not the object in someone else's. If all we do in identifying ourselves with Israel is it's the outcome of bad things that happened to us, but it's not the story of perseverance or sacrifice or community building, and the story of Jews taking destiny into our own hands, it's not the concept of self-determination. Why can't we embrace the concept of self-determination as the formal basis for learning about modern Israel? State-seeking, state-making, state-keeping. What's there wrong with the pride in saying, hey, we took an idea, we turned it into reality. We won, we made mistakes along the way, I got it. So if we want to repair the mistakes, let's repair the mistakes. But let's not repair the mistakes until we understand why we even created a Jewish state. When I did my dissertation on the land question in Palestine, I sat at the J&F archives, the Kenneth archives, and I sat at the Hebrew University archives. And I read Arabic newspapers, and I read Hebrew newspapers from the 30s and 40s. And stories about Zionists who said, you know, we're building a national home, we're buying land from the Arabs. Maybe we shouldn't take advantage of the reality that they want to sell, but they want to sell, so why shouldn't we create a place of our own? History is not just the story of one side. It's the story of all the sides blended together. And there's nothing to feel shameful about being successful. And I think being successful means you have to think about what it is you did and how you got here. But it doesn't mean you have to apologize for it. I'd like to see Zionism taught as part of Jewish history. It came about because of diligence and dedication. The authors of a day school study, 3 authors, Pomson, Wertheimer, and Hakohen Wolf, said in their recent study sponsored by the Avichai Foundation that Jewish teachers who were teaching Israel were teaching it based on emotional attachments, identification, allegiance. And the report found that among the teacher's top 10 goals, none of it had to do with understanding Israel's history or contemporary events. Complexities was just too difficult because the kids hadn't yet concretized the reason why Israel existed or why it came into being. Why is it every time an Israeli prime minister has disagreed with an American president, the disagreement has to do with an American president who wants to tell an Israeli prime minister how to measure your own security, when to do it, and how to do it? And Ben-Gurion did it with Eisenhower, and Eshkol did it with Johnson, and Golda did it with Nixon, and certainly Begin did it with Carter. And I have some personal knowledge of that because I worked for Carter for 12 years after he left the White House, and many conversations with him about why he blamed Carter, why he blamed Begin for all sorts of things. When someone wants to trot on Israeli prerogative about what to do about their own security, then the Israelis get really uptight. But that's different than taking destiny into your own hands and imposing your will on others. And that complexity has got to be taught. I would like to, I've been going on now for about 30 minutes, 35 minutes. And I'd like to leave it with this. I've already talked about why learning Israel in the United States is not compulsory amongst American Jews. So if it's not compulsory, how can we forget what we didn't learn? We learned America, as the Jews in America, we learned American history. There's no searing memory for American Jews in connection to Israel. There's searing memories for virtually every Israeli because they have individuals who died in this or that war or this or that skirmish or this or that act of terrorism. There's a memory of the place where you live and how it came into being and places you visited. And there is, for us in America, maybe some Jews, I can't be certain because I can't speak for 6.5 million Jews. There's a discomfort in being Jewish and identifying with Israel because people don't like the politics of modern Israel. I can't change the politics of modern Israel. That's not going to change the reality about the brachot that I may or may not say before and after the going up to the Torah, before and after an Aliyah. Regrettably, but understandably, American Jewish youth have become polarized, like a lot of us. And they want to distance themselves from being singled out because they may not like the politics of that country that's 5,000 miles away. But if they know why that country came into being, and they know its value and its essence, that it taught people to take destiny into their own hands, that it taught self-preservation, I think those are good qualities to understand as part of your heritage. And that's why I have found when I emphasize history with the teachers who want to learn, they're excited to do it, including many Israelis, many Israeli-born individuals who are teachers, who say they didn't learn the history of the 20s, 30s, and 40s when they were in high school. And when you give them that information and you give it to them in Hebrew, they look at you and they say, unbelievable. It's a story that shouldn't be forgotten. It's a story that should be told. It's a story to be prideful of, but it's also a story that says, you know, we didn't always do it the right way. But that's okay. That's what history's about. History's about learning from your past experiences. I think it's great to identify a positive feeling about the state of Israel, but I think it's more than an emotional response. I'm not saying an emotional response is not valid or an experiential response is not valid. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying a conceptual identification with the state, a concept of taking destiny into your own hands is exactly what we do every day in the United States or in any democracy. And to be prideful of people who did that, that's pretty good. I was on the back porch with my 18-year-old grandson last night. And he asked me, what are you going to be doing the next couple of days? I said, I'm going to be talking about Israel education in North America. He's going to be a senior in high school. He looked at me as if he knew exactly what to say. He said, what Israel education in North America, Pops? What are you talking about? And that's the essence. He is the grandson, the great-grandson of two German Jewish immigrants who came here in the 30s and escaped Nazism just after Hitler came to power. And, you know, the fact that I happened to teach it for 43 years, he's been able to imbibe a lot from me. And I'm thankful for that. But he called me out last night on the back porch before he had brisket over baked potatoes. And we can do a better job. We can do a better job in the United States. We can do a better job in Israel of Israelis learning about the diversity of American Jews. We can do a better job in the United States of American Jews learning about the diversity and the complexities of Israel. But that takes time, it takes dedication, it takes reading. It takes us away from the blog. It takes us away from that incredible email that the person next door has said, you have to read this. This is the most important thing in the world. And it has to take us away from the executive summary. Learning means putting in the time, but there's a value of it. And I think that all of us, particularly in a partnership relationship, like you guys have between St. Louis and the land on the one hand and Yokneam on the other, you have a great opportunity to share learning experiences, which I'm sure you do already. And the stories of how you got to where you are, and the stories of how Jews in St. Louis and Jews in Atlanta got to where they are. Those personal relationships, those personal stories are great, but learned in the context of what is modern Israel and what does it stand for. Hilla, Eliad, thank you for allowing me, for giving me an opportunity. I hope I didn't go on too long, and I would be glad to answer questions if there are any. I'll try and be brief.
I have a question, please. May I?
If you identify yourself, sir.
Sure. So first of all, thank you, Professor. It was eye-opening and extremely interesting. My name is Yaron. I'm the Israel representative of the Federations of Atlanta and St. Louis, working alongside with Eliad and Hila and so many others. And the things you talked about briefly, but these are the topics we are struggling and breaking our heads over all the year. I have so many questions. I will take one. Do you think that the latest events in the past year of assaults on Jewish institutes, of the sense of the decrease maybe of the social security with the increase of anti-Semitism, does these trends do you think they will change or make the younger generation rethink its position as a Jewish minority? I see you already nodding, but do you think it's going to change something?
That's a great question. My grandchildren, the oldest ones, they've never tasted anti-Semitism in the United States. My son, who went to a private school, we once had when he was in 10th or 11th grade, we had a swastika painted in our driveway. And that was because of something that happened in school. You have to be careful about generalizing about the tragedies of places like Pittsburgh and saying that it's happened all too frequently throughout the entire country. They're tragic acts. Does that make one want to identify more with the Jewish state or with being Jewish because of it? I think it has to do with what was your identity to being Jewish and your identity to Israel before the event. And does the event catalyze your feelings positively, let's say? I know there's more discussion within the Jewish communities in North America in the weeks and the months after these, shootings. But let's be honest. Events in the public sphere dissipate so very, very fast. Think about the last 4 years of shootings that have taken place, the use of violence, the gun violence, and the notion, particularly at a school in Florida, and here I'm not emphasizing one over the other as one is more or less bad than the other. They're all horrendous. But we were supposed to have gun legislation in the United States, not take away a person's Second Amendment rights, but restrictions on which ones you could buy, etc. That never materialized. I don't know what the duration will be in American society in the absorption of understanding what happened in Minneapolis and what is sprinkled across the country in the last 10 days. What will be the duration for government to change attitudes? And I think I've learned as a historian, the most difficult thing in the world is to legislate social feeling. It's very difficult to do. It's got to be in a person's interest for it to be done. And then what is long lasting about it? It's horrendous what has happened in American cities the last 10 days. Terrible. And I hope there's a memory. But as a historian, I want to say point blank, I'm not sure our kids have memories. And I don't think they have memories, and I don't necessarily mean Jewish kids. I think people don't have memories because they don't have context. Does my grandson know the Civil Rights Act of 1964? No, he happens to live in Atlanta, so he's been to Auburn Avenue, so he's been to the Martin Luther King Center. He gets it, he knows it. But we are raising a generation of students without memory, wherever they happen to be. I mean, ask yourself the question, do Jewish students, the kids, Israeli students, who were born 20 years ago, have the same memory that the three of you have of what is Israel? How has their memory been crafted by the last 20 years as compared to yours? And I'm not, please excuse me for a moment, I imagine the three of you are between the ages of 25 and 50. If I've overstated that, I apologize. But their memories are so different than yours. I've taken a long time to answer a very difficult question. I apologize. If trips to Israel resume, birthright resumes, Mossad gets back up to its level, kids can go to Jewish camp again next summer, day schools will be forever hurt by the economic downturn because donors and contributors and parents don't have the ability anymore to support what they did. So there's going to be a dent taken there. There's a dent taken already in Jewish communities in North America in terms of fundraising. We know that. So positions will be slashed, programs will be cut. We know there's going to be an impact. What it is, we don't know. But those of us who are engaged in community building and an identity raising can't allow, even if a program is cut, for us to not to continue to do what is necessary, as it says in the second paragraph of the Shema, teach it diligently unto their children. We have to teach it diligently into our children regardless. It doesn't matter about the dollars. We, as parents, we need to do that. That's tough to do, but we got to do it. We have to do it.
Thank you.
I have actually a lot of questions. Like you were talking and I took notes. I really think that this lecture, and I'm sure you have much more to be shared with the Shlichut department, the emissary department of the Jewish Agency. And I will ask, I think it will be much more simple questions. Just to pick your brain, like what do you think us as partnership, the partnership units create connections between specific places in the entire world with specific cities or region in Israel. How do you think we can be better in strengthening the connection, bringing Israel in a better way, bringing the concept of Jewish communities in the States, not only the States, sorry, in the entire world to Israel? Like if you have any kind of like the 2 tips from you after this amazing conversation.
I think the relationship between Jews throughout the world is more than experiences. Though those are terribly important because they're shared, they're common. You know, I have a pen pal in Yokneam. I have a teacher that I communicate with when I help teach a course in Israeli literature. Those are terribly important. But we have to go above that and deal with concepts that connect us. This concept of taking destiny into our own hands, of protecting that privilege to choose. You know, to choose to make a difference, to engage in history. You can even take it to military terms, to choose to liberate Jews at Entebbe, to choose to preemptively strike in '67, to choose to take out the Iraqi reactor. Now, you also made a choice to go into Lebanon, and maybe you'll make a choice to annex the west portions of the West Bank too. Sometimes the choices you make aren't the best ones. But the one thing that we have in common 5 generations or 6 generations ago when we left North Africa or we left Europe was we chose to keep alive the idea of choice. And what is Shema Yisrael other than choice? So you can have experience, you can have musicians dealing with one another, or people dealing with literature with one another, or cooking with one another. But we're prideful in the fact that we chose to sustain our identity even in difficult moments, and that's why we're a community that relies upon one another. That, I believe, should be a hallmark of the Jewish agency. That, I think, should be a hallmark of partnership. That, I think, should be a constancy between Jews when they relate to one another. Doesn't mean we don't relate to Germans who believe in self-determination, or Jews or non-Jews who live in Chile. But it's what has kept us alive. That's why I haven't said this before, but I hope it comes out right. We say Kiddush, so we have the privilege to say Kaddish. It matters. Choice is a privilege. And I think it's inherent in Jewish learning, it's inherent in Jewish identity, it's inherent in Zionism, it's inherent in American Jewish experience. I never said this out loud before in this way, but so thank you for asking.
Oh. We want more.
Yes, we want more.
Yeah.
Now we are going to think about another lecture for our teachers here in Israel. I think they also should hear you.
Well, if I did that, then what I would do, well, before I finish, I want people to understand the website and understand the whole purpose of the website, www.israeled.org, israeled.org, the title of the website, Israel Education. The whole purpose is to provide to people information about what is Israel, what does it represent. It's got a 900 entry timeline. It has Israel divided according to themes. It has important source documents in Israeli history, in Hebrew, in Spanish, and in English. I'd love to help, love to work with, love to engage, love to discuss with Israeli teachers. It would be my honor to do so. It would be a joy. If that's the best thing that comes out of this, this would be extraordinary for me.
Yeah, we are here. We know where you live. So
Well, thank you. Now you sound like someone from The Godfather. That's all right. When I get to Israel next, we're going for a good meal at least.
Of course.
Sure.
Yeah. Oh, wow. What an inspiring evening. Thank you so much, Professor Stein. Thank you, Hila, for all the coordination of this program.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. And
I personally enjoyed every minute, and I'm sure that we will stay in touch. I mean, I think we have a lot to talk about.
Yes, thank you so very much for inviting me. It was a pleasure.
Hila is the education coordinator, so all the programs that we're doing with Jewish day schools in Atlanta and Yokneam and Megiddo, all the curriculums that she builds with the teachers, so we'll have more programming now.
אפשר להגיד שאני מוכן?
יאללה. גם אנחנו.
מחכים לך.
ברצון.
תודה רבה, Professor Stein. This is Michal from the Weber School. Always a pleasure to listen to you.
Thank you.
And I love the idea of all of us working together, educators from the ground in Israel and from here, working to not only bring our children closer, our students closer, but really ourselves closer, so that we do transfer the same messages here and in Israel. So thank you for that. And I love that idea, Hila, let's do it. We are your partners at the Weber School.
יופי.
להתראות, תודה רבה.
להתראות.
תודה רבה.
ביי.
תודה.
Sei gesund.
Sei gesund. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.